Hi there, I'm Gugulethu Mfuphi, the host of Kaya Biz here on Kaya 959. So as you know, we always talk about business updates, economic data and facts and figures, right? And today we're going to talk about one particular key economic indicator that the world over uses as a measure for economic growth. 3 letters, GDP. 2 numbers, 1.2%. So let's take it back and break it down for you slightly. GDP, gross domestic product. Don't be thrown off by the technicalities and how big this word actually sounds. It essentially is a measure of how much a country is actually able to produce. The higher the number and the higher the rate of production, that essentially means that that economy is performing quite well. So think of it this way. The number of agricultural activity, how that speaks to the number of fruits and vegetables we're able to harvest, not only consume locally, but also export to international markets. Think of the number of cars that we're able to produce and put together in our automobiles environment. The manufacturing sector, how quickly it is that we put together TV sets, cell phones, and other products that are later sold into the local and international markets. All of that essentially makes up GDP, and it's used as a key economic indicator to measure the performance of any economy globally. Now, there's a lot of arguments as to whether or not it should be the only measure that's looked at, and that's quite fair. But for this particular moment and for this particular exercise and video that I want to discuss with you, we'll keep to GDP being used as a primary example as to how competitive an economy actually is. So now let's talk about the numbers. 1.2%. For the second quarter of 2021. Statistics South Africa published these GDP figures, and that 1.2% was actually met quite positively. Why? Because it's an improvement in comparison to what we saw in the previous quarter, which recorded 1% economic growth. But there's good news and there's bad news. Let's start with the good. So what this essentially tells us is that certain sectors of South Africa's economy actually saw an uptick. Elements and services like telecommunications, because there's an increased demand in terms of data usage, phone calls that are made and how South Africans are keeping in contact. Agriculture, food is food and everybody needs to eat. So that's been a sector that's been performing, as well as financial services and public and personal services. So if you consider how some sectors of the restaurant and hospitality environment have opened up, on the back of the vaccination drive, these are the elements that actually contributed to better GDP figures in the second quarter of this year. The bad news? Well, this essentially comes on the back of what's been called the rebasing of South Africa's economy and its GDP figures specifically. What that essentially means is that Statistics South Africa has now taken additional elements into consideration when measuring what GDP is. So think of it as a maths calculation. Before, you just used to solve for X using A and B, but now you decide to add C into the calculation. And those are elements that were previously ignored when it came to measuring the outcomes of a particular economy. Now, bear in mind that rebasing a country's GDP is not something that's unusual or uncommon. It's actually common practice in global markets, but the only element that should be notified is the fact that when a country's GDP is rebased, specifically an emerging market like South Africa, it usually has more substantial impact in comparison to our developed peers who might be in Europe or even in America, whose numbers and economies are fairly well established. So any rebasing or recalculation and adjustment is not as significant as what it would be as within an emerging market. So, as I mentioned, there's good and there's bad news that came out of the GDP. And what we need to remember is that it's a quarterly comparison to the same time last year. And when you think about the second quarter of the month of the year of 2021 in comparison to the second quarter of 2020, those are 3 specific months: April, May, and June. In 2020, those particular months made up the hard level 5 lockdown. In comparison to 2021, we've had a little bit more freedom, so it essentially is a measure of 2 extremes. One, where the economy was completely shut down, minimal travel bans that were implemented, and sectors of the economy that just had no activity. And this time around, where parts of the economy are actually seeing some kind of movement. So many have said that this might not necessarily be a very fair reflection of the economic performance, primarily because the backgrounds and the basis of the calculation is completely different. But one thing economists have brought forward is that whilst we are seeing an improvement in South Africa's economy, we do need to be cognizant of the fact that we have a long way to go before we reach pre-pandemic levels. According to many analysts, essentially where South Africa's economic growth is now in the middle of 2021 compares to the same kind of growth rate that we actually saw in 2017. Let that sink in. Essentially, a lot of work needs to be done, from the policies to improving our vaccination rate and slowly reopening up our economy to make sure that there's increased level of participation, where more jobs can be created, where the petrol price perhaps is more stable. Our currency also is received in a positive light and remains competitive against its international counterparts. So, whilst the economic numbers might be confusing, whilst they might show some positive prospects, it is important for us to look at this from a realistic point of view and relative to other themes that are prevalent within South Africa's economy. So, what do we need to take out of this? Well, we have a very realistic picture of South Africa's economy. Truth is, things are not that great. As a matter of fact, we actually need to work even harder, invest in people, services, infrastructure to make sure that these all have a long-term ripple effect on making sure we have a skillful workforce that is either employable or our employers themselves and are able to capitalize on infrastructure to move goods and services more quickly in and out of the country. Not only that, we also need necessary social infrastructure, schools, hospitals to take care of people. Because once you have your health and your life, you actually are able to have your livelihood, which then translates into you being an economic participant of South Africa's economy. So it's a tough road ahead, but let's certainly make sure that we continue to see collaborative efforts between business and government, and that we as South Africans are given the constant opportunity to invest in our own country, to actively create jobs and seek jobs, and most importantly, live for better outcomes that not only have a great impact on our pocket, but also on our livelihoods.